I think we're ready to invite our next panelists up on stage. Kevin, Othman, and Gabe, come on up. So I mentioned earlier in my presentation that I'm excited about biotech and the information. Full disclosure, genetics in particular, I'm having a son in January, and it was like a big whirlwind lesson in not just thinking about genetics, but actually I've used both of your products. Haven't used Freenome yet, but I've benefited from some of the technology that is behind Freenome in this process as well. So that's full disclosure why I'm fascinated in this space. But maybe to start briefly, because I think the audience might not be familiar with each of your companies and your place within the sort of testing diagnostic world. Maybe you can just go down the line and tell us what your company does and what you think people need to know about it quickly, and then we'll dive in.
Sure. So I run Freenome, and we perform deep learning of cell-free DNA genomics to accurately diagnose and detect cancer early, cancer and other diseases early.
Yeah, and Counsyl has been founded in 2007, 2008, and we provide genetic testing for people at critical moments in their life. And the main ones that we have now are people that are pregnant or thinking about becoming pregnant, and we are able to tell if they're at risk for any inherited disease. So we've offered this product to about over 500,000 people across the US, and we are now getting also into offering screening for people later in life to see if they're at risk for hereditary cancers as well.
We were actually customers as well, so thank you for the great work. I'm Othman Laraki. I am co-founder of Color Genomics. We focus on a set of genes that predispose people to different hereditary cancers. We started off initially around breast and ovarian cancer, but now cover a lot of the big ones like also colon cancer, prostate, and a number of others. And what we've done that's a bit different is that we're essentially a company at the juncture, a little bit of biology and software, and have used that to dramatically reduce the cost of accessing some of these tests. And so whereas tests normally cost thousands of dollars, we launched about a year ago with a test at $250 that kind of fundamentally changes the math on how you think about genetics and when people can get tested.
So for both Kevin and Othman, I mean, your products are things you can, well, I can get color online. Counsyl I got from my doctor. Can people just get it online as well? And
You can. We do have a channel with which you can go online, be essentially referred to a doctor, and then the doctor will prescribe it to you. It is not the majority of the business. The majority of the business, people don't enter genetics the same way you did, which is they were perfectly healthy. They got pregnant at their first wellness check. They were told, hey, these are the new advances in medicine that you can now be exposed to and that you can now have as a way to impact your family's health, and they can be affordable, they can be very actionable. And then we see that's still the main way in which people come in to use Counsyl's products is through their doctors.
Mm-hmm. Great. And so what technologies, I mean, Othman, you mentioned the cost plummeting, right, of sequencing, but what else is driving this and where is it going? I mean, it seems like it's moving incredibly quickly, and then we'll get to Gabe and Cellfree, which I think is a little bit different too. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say that if you're just trying to take the whole world of genetics as a whole, it always reminds me of the computer industry kind of in the 1980s. We have one of these large institutions which have essentially set up with these laboratory developed tests. Counsyl is one of which is a centralized place in which we have ridiculously high quality screening in which we're able to impact people for known ways in which genetics impacts health. So this is the way in which you were essentially the established medical community and the advances in the tooling to make that now cheap and affordable. But really the exciting one will be in that turn that you had in the 1980s, which you all of a sudden had a workstation in the hands of people across the US. And now you have a broad democratization of that genetic technology to expand beyond. And I think that's really will be the exciting new frontiers that we don't yet even know about, which is we know how to produce ridiculously high quality medical diagnostic systems that are of proven science. Really, what does it look like when genetics becomes a lot more pervasive technology?
And is that big data? I mean, to put it in tech terms, like what is it? Is it processing power? I mean,
Yeah, I would say, so I have the opinion that the majority of the thing we're hitting up against in genetics isn't actually even the ability to do sequencing. It's very complex. We put a lot of people, we invest heavily in doing very high quality sequencing.
That was the whole Human Genome Project, right? I mean, it was on the cover of Time magazine for like
Yep.
17 times or something. Yeah.
We can do it. We can actually do it relatively affordably, such that we can offer tests and they can be covered by insurance or even be paid directly out of pocket. But really what you now have for new opportunities is what is clinically actionable or what is proven science. We're actually hitting up against the level of just content of what do these mutations mean for you. So the classical way in which many of the inherited cancer was is if you had a family with high instances of cancer, you could see, hey, half the family was very high risk of cancer, and if that half the family had this genetic variant, I know this genetic variant causes cancer. So, but then you're always limited to essentially having a family affected with many people with cancer. So you're always hit up against that limit. So the next step will be, what is it like to do genetic insights from a mutation no one's ever seen before, or a new piece of data no one's ever seen before? They may be similar to other pieces of data, but now I have to make a new determination from a new frontier in what we can sequence.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So Gabe, talk a little bit about, I mean, how Freenome works and what cell-free DNA really is as a technology. And
Sure. So what Freenome does is a little bit different than what these two guys do. Color and Counsyl, at least the products that they've released, have largely focused on mutations in your germline. So these are mutations that you're born with, that's largely in all of the cells in your body. And we know that some of the cancers and other diseases are inherited. It's relatively a small portion of cancers that are actually inherited. But you can actually figure out what these germline mutations are, and that raises your chances of having cancer at some point. Freenome uses cell-free DNA, which are DNA fragments that are free-floating in your blood, that actually turns over every 20 minutes. So there's your genome that you're sort of born with, and a lot of people ask me, where does the name Freenome come from? Well, Freenome is actually a shortening of cell-free genome, which is essentially an instantaneous snapshot of your genome at that time, right? What a lot of people don't understand or have not thought about is your genome actually changes as you age. So the cancers that are not inherited actually come from mutations and genomic instabilities that you're accumulating throughout your lifetime. So we use cell-free DNA. We test your Freenome on a regular basis. And when your Freenome starts deviating from what's your normal baseline is, then we can use that to detect diseases such as cancer at the earliest points possible.
And what stage are you in? Are you in trials, or you have products on the market?
Yeah, so we are in trials, and the first of our products should be, you'll hear about them soon.
Okay, fair enough. Excellent. So all VC backed?
I think by the same VC in one instance.
Yeah, I think we share Founders Fund, and Andreessen Horowitz led our last round.
Got it.
Yeah.
So I think there's a lot of discussion now of VC backing for biotech. I mean, it's not traditional software companies, right? Different failure rates, different time horizons. How do you guys think about that as a funding source, and what do you think about it? Is it going to be the funding source that leads to the next big, the companies that are big breakthroughs versus, research? I mean, there are a million different models, but.
Well, I think it's interesting because before the Human Genome Project was completed, everyone thought, oh, we're going to know the cause of all diseases, right, when the Human Genome Project was completed. We spent $3 billion sequencing the first genome. And then we realized when we concluded the Human Genome Project, oh, it was like, this information doesn't really explain all causes of diseases. So entire new fields of biology came about as a result of the Human Genome Project. And a lot of them are focused on understanding this large amounts of data, right? 3 billion bases in one person's DNA. And you need to sort of figure out which parts are actually relevant for which diseases, and that's a huge computational problem. And I think what we're seeing in the last 5-10 years is the computational tools that are needed to even process the information is now finally beginning to mature to the point where we can actually start figuring out this huge informatics problem to detect the cause of these diseases.
And so that makes tie that to the funding model.
So I guess what that, in my mind, what that means is the tech VCs know very much about making sense of large amounts of information and building up companies that are focused around that. I think we live in sort of this golden age of biotech where traditional wet lab biology problems have now become dry lab problems, become computational problems. And so there's going to be this sort of new round of companies that are being formed that's really a tech company that's playing in the biotech space. I think there's going to be a lot of growing pains, and there are things that I think even the tech investors will admit that they're learning to sort of handle now. But it is this golden age where tech investors, tech companies will drive forward a lot of innovation in the biology space.
Yeah. And just, I would think that one of the difficulties for the VCs will be that when you're investing in a company like Counsyl, it has technological advancements in many different multidisciplinary areas. So we're not only leaders in genetics, we're also leaders in robotics and in software engineering and in patient workflow applications and in how we deliver on-demand genetic counseling. And so you're investing in a very large technology system to deliver these results. And so it's a larger of a chunk, and it's not just a single one-dimensional software play anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing to add on that too is like that we're still, I think, very much at the first innings of the industry, and it feels like in the early days everything looks much smaller than it will eventually become. And so it's kind of like in the early internet days, like everyone thought that you had to be an internet portal, and you had kind of all the companies looked like they were going to be very similar eventually, but you ended up getting Amazon and Google, et cetera, that kind of really went very deep, building these kind of massive applications. And I think we're still in that point where in many ways we have this kind of primitive, and in some ways the old way to look at product, I think, is going to turn out to not be the way that in which companies really succeed. Like I think there's still this mindset that people think about products as a test, whereas the only reason it makes sense to think of it like that is if testing is very, very hard and very expensive. But to your point, like it's where that's going to become a commodity, and we view that as converging to zero, basically. Like literally, the cost of running these tests are not quite zero, but like essentially to the point where the cost is not the reason to not get someone tested. And in that world, it's very much around building the applications that deliver value to people. And I think unlike a consumer application, it won't be kind of people Snapchatting on an app or something like that. But it would be, I think it's going to be initially very aligned with directly impacting how long people live, how well they deal with disease, catching disease early, et cetera. So I think that's where I think figuring out what are those applications, because I think essentially we now just have a building block. And for the venture industry, it's going to be around developing these theses around what is the application really like. Because I think that right now a lot of people are thinking of it in a very narrow way, whereas I think it becomes just a building block, something much bigger than that.
So has Theranos made your lives harder? I mean, is there more skepticism either from across the board, public investors? What do you think will be the next 3-year impact of that on your industry?
It's not a good thing. It's not a good thing from the standpoint of even they were trying to offer what would be perceived as very impactful medical diagnostics, and we value that very heavily. We know the power of these new technologies is to prevent disease, to improve patient outcomes. And we're so excited about that. We invest so much energy in that, and we put so much work into engineering that level of quality that you want the entire industry as a whole to grow together. The funny thing in the genetics industry is we actually are not competitors with one another, because our biggest competitor is people not knowing that these new technologies are out there, that they now have this improved patient outcome. So anything that's not growing that adoption of this as a high technology, very properly engineered system is a step backward.
I think also when things like Theranos happen, by the way, is that it really creates an opportunity for the industry to have a statement of values in some sense, and it really kind of emphasizes the value of doing due diligence as an investor, and emphasizes the value of having the medical side really well covered, transparency around information. So in some ways it's it's obviously not a good thing for the industry or for Silicon Valley at large. I think anyone who's dealing with healthcare related work in Silicon Valley. But on the flip side, I think it really does. I think it's one of those things that, if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And I think that's really what's happening with as a side effect of that, in my opinion.
Yeah, I actually agree with that wholeheartedly. I don't think there's been too much pushback, especially if you have data to support your claims. It's not really a problem, but a healthy amount of skepticism is actually necessary, and I think sort of Silicon Valley tech companies disrupt that mentality is good in some ways, but it doesn't always call for a whole lot of prudence, which I think is something that we need more of in the biotech space.
Gabe, you talked about, bringing tech people into these companies being amalgam of the data science and the biologists, but I also wonder, does that work? In the sense that it seems like it'd be more complicated than marrying these cultures, and what's been your experience? And
yeah, so I was a software engineer before I did my grad work in computational biology, and I also did wet lab biology during my grad work. And I spend most of my time probably translating between the software engineers, the machine learning people, the computational biologists, and the molecular biologists, because they speak entirely different languages. And I think the funny thing is like most of the time they're agreeing, but they don't really understand that they're agreeing. So the communication is really a challenge when you're bringing in these kinds of different groups together. That being said, I think because genomics has essentially made a lot of these biological problems, computational problems, we do have a common language that we can speak. And over time, people that don't necessarily come in with that vocabulary understand and learn that vocabulary, and then they can speak to each other and work together. But from a cultural perspective, it's also challenging because software engineers and people traditionally in tech expect certain things out of the culture, and
like
there's
foosball's tables, that kind of stuff?
there's that stuff that's more fluffy, but I think there's also things like how they want to work, how much oversight that they want to have, how much sort of top-down direction they want, where software engineers really don't often like top-down approach to things. But people who are coming from academia, who are researchers by training, they've always had a top-down approach to things, where their primary investigators has largely guided them on what they should do research on. So like there's an expectation of direction, and pretty firm direction, I think, on the wet lab side that you don't necessarily see on the computational side. And it's challenging to have one company culture that can handle those different ideas of company structure.
It's a challenge, but I think it's also the biggest asset. I know we've seen that the software engineers are most happy when they get to interact with the scientists, and the scientists are most happy when they get to interact with the software engineers. So even though they can be very different cultures, I think as we pitch candidates, we actually see that's the one that excites them the most. That's what draws people, is that multidisciplinary ability to interact.
Yeah.
It's like the other side almost sometimes feels like a group of people that have these incredible superpowers. For example, for the biologists, the software engineers are able to do things that normally are super labor intensive, and they can kind of take a process that is very important, but then build so much automation around it that it becomes much more efficient. Just to give you one example, whenever we make any changes to a report like that, people get, it's a clinical report, so it has to be very tightly controlled and approved, et cetera. And so normally you have like this committee that does a lot of stuff manually, et cetera. We also, for example, just build tools that whenever codes get pushed, there are screenshots that happen automatically, and it does a diff, and it kind of lets you know if there's a change. And that kicks off a new process, and all the biologists are like, oh my God, this is amazing. And to the software engineers, it's like, oh yeah, that's like normal web development.
I feel that way about the software engineers on our team, so I guess. Very quickly, last question. So the regulatory environment, we saw 23andMe sort of get slapped by the FDA a while ago and pull their stuff, but would you just say what's changed? I sometimes hear from entrepreneurs that they think that it's getting a bit easier to work with the FDA. That's a self-interested point of view there. But just sort of quickly, anything on the horizon there, if there were biotech folks out there who were worried about it, what would you kind of say to them?
So I would say talk to the FDA as early as possible would be the best advice I can give. Because I think a lot of companies in the space, they're afraid to sort of go and talk to the regulatory bodies. But in every interaction that I've had with the FDA, they really want to understand the technology. They really want to talk to us about the things that they understand very little, because this convergence of biotech and tech is a very new thing, and a lot of the people at the FDA don't necessarily understand it. But the sooner you talk to them and the sooner you familiarize them with your approach to doing things, the more willing they're going to be to help you out through the regulatory process.
Excellent. Great. Well, thank you guys so much. And I have a feeling we're going to be hearing a lot more about your companies in the future. So
Thank you.
thanks again.
Thank you.
Yes.